where the vineyard slopes of the southern Eifel sink down into the Mosel Valley between Traben-Trabach and Bernkastel-Kues. The river bends into a broad loop, and, cradled in that bend, sits the old wine-growing town of Kröv. The town's name is known, above all, for its wine, but for just as long, Kröv has also been home to professional fishermen, responsible for a working stretch of river between Traben-Trabach and Kinheim. Seen from above, the town curls along the riverbank below its vineyards. Closer in, the streets narrow and climb toward the church spire at the town's center, houses lining both sides. The fisherman's house stands at the downstream edge of town, right where the main riverside road and the old town street split apart, giving the house two ways in, one from the water side at the back, one through the front door facing the street. A fisherman lives here now in the third generation of his family, 70 years old, who learned the trade alongside his brother from their father before the last war. Fishermen who once rowed out at first light to work the river haven't made their living from it since 1963, the year the Mosel was rebuilt into a shipping channel. Raising the water level behind the new lock stages and reshaping the riverbanks to match wiped out the old fishing grounds entirely, drowning familiar shallows and current lines that had guided this family's work for generations. Even the traditional gear these fishermen had relied on for decades turned out to be largely useless under the new conditions, built for a river that, in most of the ways that mattered to a working fisherman, simply no longer existed. What did survive the changeover was the stake net, a method barely known on the Mosel before, but one that at least opened up a new way to keep fishing at all. Two men, one older and one younger, row a long, shallow wooden boat, a nachen, steadily out across the calm water, the town and its church visible behind them. Nearing the far bank, the older man switches from rowing to a long pole, guiding the boat in against the overgrown shoreline. Here, a net set out the evening before is about to be retrieved. Reaching into the bushes along the bank, he finds the anchor line, unties it, and begins hauling hand over hand, the fine mesh curtain rising slowly out of the water behind it. A stake net is essentially a self-standing wall of mesh, set crosswise across the slow current, where fish get caught by their gill covers as they try to swim through. The fine synthetic netting hangs upright in the water, held taut by a cork-strung float line along the top and a lead line along the bottom. As more of it comes up, the first fish appear tangled in the weave, silver flashes catching the light, a larger one thrashing briefly as it clears the surface. At the far end, a plain stone serves as the anchor, and it's the last thing lifted, swung up and into the boat once everything else is aboard. Today's catch, mostly tench and bream, comes to a good 25 pounds, and for now, it stays right where it is, tangled in the mesh. Back at the boat's center, the older fisherman opens a wooden hatch set into the floor, the live well, water-filled, and bundles the whole net down inside it, sealing the lid before they push off from the bank for the trip home. The landing spot at Kröv sits directly below the fisherman's house, marked with warning signage so passing cargo ships and motorboats keep their distance from the small boat. Chained to the wooden dock floats a slatted wooden container called a vihe, or sometimes a weichen, hauled over now to take the day's catch. Its lockable lid and perforated floor keep the fish alive and swimming, and one by one the older fisherman reaches down into the live well, works each fish carefully free of the tangled mesh, and drops it with a splash into the floating box. Since sales mainly happened on Fridays, every fish caught earlier in the week had to be kept alive and genuinely fresh right up until then. The whole live well and floating box system built around that one deadline. A catch this decent shows the Mosel hasn't lost the fish stocks it was once famous for, not by a long way. And it's worth pausing on that, since the collapse of the fishing trade here isn't really about a river run empty of fish. So if professional fishing here still collapsed anyway, part of the reason is that the especially valuable species, the ones hotels once paid well for, salmon and eel, have largely disappeared from this stretch of river entirely, no longer running the routes they once did. Part of it, too, is that the steelworks now operating along the Mosel badly disrupt fish migration up and down the channel, cutting off routes fish once used freely between spawning grounds and feeding grounds. And even setting all that aside, the native pike, zander, and barbel, the finer table fish that customers actually wanted most and paid the best prices for, were never easy to catch with a stake net in the first place. Its mesh simply isn't built to catch fish that hunt rather than drift with the current, no matter how many of them are still out there. What a stake net does reliably catch is simply whatever's left to be caught. Mostly tench and bream, rudd, chub, roach. Common, resident species that always went into these nets in real numbers. Once the catch is sorted, the boat gets tied off for the day. Before channelization, fishermen simply hauled it straight up onto a flat stretch of beach. Now it has to float free instead, kept clear of the stone-reinforced bank so the wake from passing ships doesn't slam it against the rocks overnight. In the early 60s, when demand was still strong, Kröv fishermen worked as many as 20 stake nets at once along their 7.5-kilometer stretch, enough to supply villages well into the Eifel with fresh river fish every Friday. But cheap, boneless sea fish, sold already prepared and ready to cook, gradually undercut that demand until the work stopped paying for itself. On the water-facing back of the fisherman's house, a wide veranda was added on in the 1950s, considerably expanding the cellar space beneath it. A sign out front still advertises freshly smoked eels for sale. Down here, through a large door opening, every piece of fishing gear the family still owns is kept. A triangular mesh net stretched taut between two poles, and beside it a thick, rolled net bag wound around its own pair of poles, known locally as the Trampeltier. The two fishermen emerge from this storeroom together, the older one carrying a bundled net, the younger one loaded down with several long wooden poles. Rising nearly 6 meters above the roofline, visible from well down the street, stands a tall mast, once the unmistakable mark of a Mosel fisherman's house from anywhere along the river. It was used for drying hemp nets, especially the cone-shaped ones that taper to a sharp point, nets that spread open wide in the air when thrown and sink straight down to the riverbed. One of those hangs from a pulley system rigged to the mast right now, the Wurfgeil, its lower rim weighted with lead and fitted with a ring of small catch pockets. The two men worked together to lower it, heavy, thick coils of netting descending slowly, the younger man steadying the bottom as it nears the pavement, until the older fisherman finally unhooks it from the pulley rope and hoists the whole bundle over one shoulder. Fishing with both the Wurfgeil and the Trampeltier stopped for good once the Mosel was rebuilt. Neither has worked on the canalized river since. For this film, though, both methods are demonstrated once more. The older fisherman carries the heavy net across a paved road, a guardrail separating it from the riverbank, vineyards visible on the far shore. The younger man jogs to catch up, pole and rolled Trampeltier balanced over his shoulder, and together they head down toward a flight of concrete stairs leading to the dock below. The mooring spot sits across that same busy road, down a bank fairly steep along the outer curve of the bend. At the bow, poles wrapped in newspaper mark the Wurfgeil gear. At the stern waits the small Y-hair box, a bucket of fish feed, and a hand scoop. The fishing grounds lie across the river, on the inside of the bend where the current runs calmer. In the deeper main channel, this boat, 8.5 meters long, is worked with a steering oar and a long pole, its raised sides in full 70-centimeter height, setting it apart from the flat 40-centimeter boats fishermen once used, which became useless once cargo ship wakes started swamping them. There were two traditional ways to fish the Wurfgeil. Rotten worked with 4 to 6 boats together in daylight, and Fedon worked entirely alone, usually just before nightfall. A Fedon trip always went out with a single boat, timed to leave just before dusk, when the light was fading but the river hadn't gone fully dark yet, the whole approach relying on stealth in a way daylight fishing never needed to. Before the actual fishing could begin, though, the fish first had to be lured, drawn deliberately toward specific spots, chosen for open, still water where the current barely moved at all. Nothing like the open channel further out where the boat had just come from. Choosing well here mattered as much as anything that came after. A poorly chosen spot meant an empty net, no matter how well the throw itself went, so this early groundwork counted for more than it might look like from the outside. Fishermen marked each intended spot with a length of rope tied around a stake driven into the riverbed, since fettern fishing only ever happened at night, and a scrap of newspaper tied near the top of the marker made it that much easier to spot again once darkness had fully set in. The bait itself, a mixture of cooked potatoes and whole wheat grains kept ready in a plastic bucket in the boat, got thrown into the water in handfuls right at the marker, the fisherman standing and sweeping his arm wide, and sank slowly to settle on the riverbed below. The splash and sudden noise of throwing it would scare the fish off across a wide stretch of river at first, but they'd drift back once the water went quiet again in the growing dark. This whole approach worked especially well when the river ran low. In summer, with the Mosel at low levels and barely any current at all, fishermen often prepared more than a dozen spots this way in a single evening, each one set roughly 50 meters from the next, far enough apart that the noise from working one net never carried far enough to spook the fish waiting at the next spot down the bank. Once the baiting was done, the wait before the real nighttime fishing could begin ran at least 2 hours. For the sake of this film, that whole run had to be compressed into the last scraps of daylight instead, the crew working against a clock the original fishermen never had to worry about. When the moment finally came, the boat glided toward the baited spot in near silence, moving with the current, the older fisherman standing poised at the bow with the net gathered in both hands and clenched between his teeth, the younger man behind him holding the pole steady, waiting for the signal. The same careful, stalking approach a hunter might use closing in on game rather than anything resembling ordinary fishing. Thrown properly, the net opens into a wide, perfect circle in the air, settling directly over the marker pole, the lead-weighted rim sinking fast while the tip stays held near the surface by the catch line, together shaping a cone, something like a pointed cap, closing down over the waiting fish below. It's the man at the stern working the steering oar who actually makes the catch. The moment the net lands, he has to turn the boat against the current so the thrown net doesn't drift out of position, then fix everything in place by driving his own pole hard down into the riverbed and holding it firm against his palm. Bringing the Wurfgeil back up has to happen as close to straight vertical as possible. As it rises, the weighted hem draws together at the bottom, and that motion opens the catch pockets stitched along the inside, trapping whatever fish are caught inside the closing net. Partway through hauling, the fisherman pauses and takes up a long pole instead, thrusting it down repeatedly inside the still closing circle of net, driving any fish still loose on the bottom up and into the mesh before he resumes pulling. Once fully aboard, he lifts the whole net high and shakes it hard, forcing everything caught down into the gathering pockets at the rim, then lowers it onto the wooden seat and reaches straight into the folds, pulling out one squirming silver fish after another. Before heading off toward the next feeding spot, though, there's real preparation still to do. The damp sackcloth stretched across the net bench where he stands has to be kept wet the whole time, purely so his footing doesn't slip mid-throw. To make sure the net and the throwing line stay properly connected, he ties the catch line with 2 loops around his own left upper arm, a hemp cord twisted to resist moisture running down to the tip of the 3-meter net cone, which opens to a 4-meter mouth at the bottom. The full circle of that mouth, studded thick with lead balls, measures roughly 10 meters around, and for the net to open completely on the throw, every inch of it has to be carefully arranged first, laid out flat and untangled across the bench, the weighted edge lined up precisely along the wood so nothing catches or snags. Working across the bench, he divides the rim by the order of its lead weights into a front half and a back half, draping one section over his forearm, gathering the rest into his other hand, then takes one particular lead ball from the back section and holds it in his mouth, the one meant to fly out last of all, gripped only by his lips until the whole net has fully opened in the air. All of this preparation happens while he steers toward the next spot, work that takes real, practiced skill to do quickly and correctly, over and over, throughout a single night's fishing. The best spots for the Wurfgeil had a smooth riverbed and rarely more than 1.5 meters of water over it. On the throw itself, everything has to happen fast. The whole point is an ambush, giving the fish no chance to escape before the net closes over them. Bringing it back in works the opposite way entirely. Every movement slow and deliberate, because the lead-weighted hem needs to stay in contact with the riverbed the whole time the mesh is being drawn together toward the center. The only way to make sure the trapped fish actually get pushed into the waiting catch pockets, rather than slipping free underneath at the last moment. Fettern fishing this way almost always paid off. Fishermen who knew where the fish liked to shelter could lure them in reliably with the right bait, so that hardly a single throw came up empty across a whole night's work, a real contrast with the more chance-driven rotten method used elsewhere on the river. Along the outside of the boat's hull now hangs a small basket, holding the catch and kept constantly supplied with fresh river water flowing through it, keeping everything alive until the crew makes it back to shore. On a typical nighttime run, each marked spot usually only got one throw. No second chances, no lingering once a throw was made, since a missed fish only meant more time spent chasing an already spooked spot. Here, for the film, the footsteps moving around the boat and the soft clack of lead balls being sorted while arranging the net have already scattered whatever fish were left nearby, an unavoidable side effect of filming something meant to happen in near total silence. In the old days, it was common practice to make one final pass over every baited spot again, right at the very end of the night, just before the first light of dawn broke over the vineyards on either bank. For the other Wurfgeil method, rotten, fishermen preferred bright sunny days instead, a loud, active way of driving fish with several boats working together in the open, nothing like the quiet, solitary stalking that defined a night of Fettern fishing alone. What's meant by the Koppelnetz is the gear known locally in Kröv simply as the Trampeltier, and working it properly takes 3 fishermen, not 1 or 2, a real change of pace from everything shown so far. 3 men now work a wider, flat-bottomed boat out onto the river, one at each end with a pole, one in the middle rowing steadily. Laid crosswise across the boat, front and back, 2 long poles sit ready, with the net bag itself slung between them, hanging down over the side of the hull, waiting to be lowered into the water once they've found the right spot. Of all the old fishing gear on the Mosel, this net alone stayed genuinely usable even after the river was dammed, since it works regardless of water level, unlike the Wurfgeil or the stake net, both of which depend on knowing exactly how deep the water sits. Using the 2 poles, the fishermen drive the 4-meter-wide mesh sack from open water in toward the bush-lined bank, the boat itself moving broadside first rather than bow first. As they near the overhanging branches, the youngest of the 3 steps out of the boat onto the muddy bank, helping push the net deeper into the vegetation while the other 2 work their poles. Once the net sits fully positioned under the branches, all 3 take up their poles again and strike hard against the bank, driving any sheltering fish out toward open water, straight into the waiting mouth of the net. To lift the catch, the boat pulls back off the bank, and the 2 men aboard pull the edges of the bag's opening up and secure them against the gunwale, shaking loose several large fish that tumble into the well at the bottom of the boat. Like the stake net, the Koppelnetz achieved genuinely good yields, though it too was mainly built to catch the common, everyday species that made up most of a working fisherman's income week to week, rather than anything rarer. Its tightly knotted mesh bag, fitted like the stake net with a cork float line above and a lead line below, occasionally still brought in something better: pike, zander, perch, and once in a while even eels, whenever those fish had been driven up into the right stretch of river at exactly the right moment. Nobody could count on it happening, but everyone hoped for it on every single haul, checking the bag a little more eagerly each time. Once the net was reset and ready, the fishermen could simply drive back to the bank and try again. In the old days, they knew exactly which spots paid off at which hour of the day, a working knowledge passed down as carefully as any of the actual techniques and just as essential to a good day's catch as knowing how to handle the net itself. Early morning and evening meant working the fish's known resting spots, where they gathered undisturbed to wait out the brightest and darkest hours. Through the hottest part of midday, the shaded edges along the bank offered the best odds, fish seeking out the cooler water there to escape the sun overhead. And through the late morning, fishermen would look instead for the specific stretches where predatory fish tended to lie in wait for smaller prey passing by, a completely different set of spots from where they'd been working at dawn, requiring the crew to essentially relearn the river's geography 4 separate times over the course of a single working day. The name Trampeltier, the one Kröv's own fishermen still use for themselves, comes from an older version of this same technique. Where the bank ran flat and swampy rather than steep, poles couldn't be used to drive fish out the usual way. So instead, one of the fishermen would climb out of the boat and wade straight through the reed-choked shallows on foot, stomping his way forward to push fish ahead of him into the net bag. Once the Mosel's old backwaters vanished under the new lock stages, that method went with them. As for the fish's own behavior, it changed enough after the river was rebuilt and consumer habits shifted enough alongside it that the Koppelnetz, too, eventually had to be set aside. The fishermen who still formally hold the lease on their stretch today earn only a small, occasional income now, granting permits to anglers and angling clubs instead. One has moved into wine growing full-time. The other has simply reached retirement age. Both the Koppelnetz and the stake net, introduced here only 20 years before this film was made, could still, in principle, bring in perfectly solid catches even after the Mosel's rebuilding was complete. What collapsed instead wasn't the fish, and it wasn't the fishermen's skill either. It was any real way left to sell what they caught. Men whose entire working life demanded hard-won skill and constant close attention out on the water simply never had the time or the connections or the opening to make the shift that modern marketing eventually demanded of them, and the traditional way of selling what they caught slowly stopped working at all, piece by piece, year after year, until what had once been a full livelihood barely amounted to pocket money on the side. It wasn't a single dramatic failure so much as a long, quiet erosion, one Friday sale at a time, until there was almost nothing left of the trade that had once supported 3 generations of the same family. Today, only a handful of housewives in Kröv still know how to scale and gut a live, fresh Mosel fish themselves, let alone how to turn one, bones and all, into something genuinely worth sitting down to eat. When the floating storage cages once got emptied out to supply customers directly, back when the trade was still thriving, the total catch on offer often ran to several hundredweight at a time, more fish than most households today would know what to do with. Fishermen would tow cages full of live fish behind their boats to neighboring villages up and down the Mosel to sell there too, extending their reach well beyond Kröv itself. Selling fish from a 4-wheeled handcart, the way it's demonstrated here for the film, is itself already a throwback by the time this was filmed, a return to how things worked a full 20 years earlier, not a living tradition anyone was still actually relying on. Fresh, live-caught fish from the fishing family's own women, that was the standing offer, driven out on the handcart and sold door to door every single Friday, using whatever the week's catch had brought in. Nearly every household in town took the chance to put fresh river fish on the table for the midday meal while it was still on offer, a habit that ran through practically the whole town rather than just a few loyal customers, week in and week out, for as long as anyone could remember it being any other way. The most commonly bought fish, and the cheapest, were never really sorted by species at all in these sales. Customers mostly just distinguished the smaller ones from the larger, calling them simply bakfish, meant for frying, and kochfish, meant for boiling, and buying accordingly depending on what they planned to cook that particular day. Prepared either of those 2 ways, Mosel fish were, thanks to the old Friday fasting rule observed in Catholic households, once a genuinely indispensable part of the weekly diet up and down this stretch of the river. Not a luxury, not an afterthought, but simply what Friday dinner meant for an entire generation of families living here, week after week, without exception, right up until the trade itself finally gave out under the weight of everything that had changed around it. As the sign still hanging outside the fisherman's house shows, eels are sold here even today, though they come smaller now and in far fewer numbers, mostly caught with traps rather than with nets, since the larger, fattier eels that fishermen once targeted directly with ground lines and hand nets have largely vanished with the arrival of the lock stages decades ago. Mosel fishing here hasn't been a working trade for a long time now. What's left of it survives only as something closer to a hobby, a pastime, a way of keeping a family skill alive rather than earning a living from it. True for the fishermen of Kröv today, just as it is anywhere else along this stretch of river.